What is the role of factions in the LDP, and how are they distinct from other political alliances seen in Japan or the rest of the world? Oftentimes, when people talk about Japanese politics, some confusion emerges when they get onto the topic of political factions, especially when it comes to those found in the ruling LDP, or Liberal Democratic Party. So I thought it'd be interesting to discuss the historic role factions have played, as well as some of the misconceptions that exist around them. Now, the LDP have been the largest and most important political party in Japan since the end of World War II, with much of Japan's post-war political order being defined by the 1955 system. This is where the gigantic Liberal Democratic Party would rule the country against an opposition led by the Japanese Socialist Party, with this lasting from the 1950s to the 1990s, with almost every single Japanese prime minister in the post-war period coming from the LDP or being from a party that has an alliance with the LDP. And as a result of being so large and having ruled for so long, over time a number of different political factions have emerged within the party, with these different factions even having separate business cards, offices, and staff that are not shared with the rest of the party. This also means that an LDP politician can only be a member of one faction at a time. As a result of this, it has also become common for different LDP factions to run their own candidates against each other during election time, in the hopes of increasing the size of their faction within the Japanese parliament, which is known as the National Diet. So when looking at Japanese elections, it's important to consider that the LDP is often not competing against other parties, but against itself. Now, since the LDP has historically been the largest party, these factions have become very powerful in the lower house of representatives, as they're the ones who have the final say in replacing and supporting new prime ministers, approving new cabinet members, and passing new legislation. However, unlike other political parties, these factions are not often based around political or social issues. For example, instead of having factions that are either very socially conservative or progressive, most factions are politically diverse, with there even being heavy disagreements between faction members on important policy issues. One example will be the difference between Itsunori Onodera and former Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, with Onodera, a former Minister of Defense, being seen as having a much more aggressive stance when it comes to strengthening Japan's self-defense forces when compared to Kishida, even though they both belong to the same faction within the LDP. This is because instead of using factions, many political disputes around legislation are handled by zoku, or policy tribes, with zoku being made up of politicians from many different factions that have an interest in one area of legislation. While factions are usually built around the personal relationships between the faction members and loyalty to a faction boss, with newer members being able to move up the ranks by winning elections and serving in the Diet for several decades. In exchange for this support, the higher-ranking members of the faction and the faction boss will support younger members during election time by helping them to raise money, getting supporters to turn out and vote, as well as showing up in person at campaign rallies to show their support. However, this has also led the LDP to deal with some difficult scenarios surrounding the role of money in politics, as well as the dangers of being so accessible to the public, with the former Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe, notably having been assassinated while he was on the campaign trail, giving a speech in support of an LDP candidate, with the assassin claiming that the reason he had killed Abe was because the assassin's mother had bankrupted the family by donating hundreds of thousands of dollars to the Unification Church, with the Unification Church having supported Abe's faction within the LDP for decades. Now, the reason why factional loyalty is so important is because the ultimate goal of a faction boss is to be elected president of the LDP, and since the LDP has been the largest party in parliament for several decades, by becoming LDP president, that usually means that that person would also become Prime Minister of Japan, with the logic being that if the factions became more ideological, it would only hurt a boss's chances of becoming Prime Minister. This because if there are constant ideological disputes and purity tests within a faction, it will limit the number of people who can join, and therefore limit the influence of the faction within the government. Also, it's important to remember that since these factions exist within a single political party, even though there are some differences between the faction members on certain legislation, as members of the LDP, they are already in agreement on a vast amount of issues. Also, in order to stay in power for more than 60 years, the LDP has been open to accepting a wide range of rival politicians and policies that are popular with the general public in order to stay in power, but also to increase their base of support. For example, Zenko Suzuki was first elected as a socialist. He then joined the Liberal Party, which then merged into the LDP, with Suzuki eventually rising up through the ranks to become LDP Prime Minister of Japan in 1980. And when the LDP lost control of the House for the first time in 1993, they teamed up with their longtime socialist rivals and a splinter LDP faction to regain control of the government, giving Japan their first socialist prime minister since 1947. And when calls for more social welfare programs became popular with union members and Japanese socialists, The LDP took these policies and repackaged them as their own, with the LDP seeing this as just responding to the needs of the public, as well as a political opportunity to convert these socialist voters into LDP supporters. Now, one of the explanations why these factions exist in the LDP was based on an old argument about how hierarchical Japanese culture is, with the emphasis on hierarchy being seen in the Japanese language, as well as in the stereotypes that exist around how traditional apprenticeships require a student to work and learn from an older master for several years before being able to start out on their own. However, more recently, political scientists have started to see this argument as flawed, because these very exclusive, personal factions in the LDP are not seen as much in other political parties. For example, in the Japanese Socialist Party, they are much more divided on issues surrounding socialist philosophy, as well as foreign policy. These factions also didn't exist in the two conservative parties that united to form the LDP, with this being the Liberal and Democratic parties. Instead, it looks like these factions gradually formed over time as a reaction to the merging of these two parties to form the LDP in 1955, and as a result of the LDP elections for a party president. Now, the Liberal Party was largely made up of government bureaucrats who moved into politics after the end of World War II, while the Democratic Party was largely made up of the pre-war political elite, and initially, the LDP was led by a committee of 2 liberals and 2 Democrats. Eventually, during the first competitive election for party president in 1956, the 3 major candidates were 2 Democrats, Kishi and Ishibashi, and 1 liberal, Ishii. Now, the general expectation when looking at this scenario is to assume that these 2 parties would continue to exist within the LDP, with there being a faction made up of liberals and there being a faction made up of Democrats, and that this vote for LDP president would be divided along old party lines. However, that wasn't the case, because Ishii would end up supporting Ishibashi, who would be elected party president as well as Prime Minister of Japan, with researchers such as Krauss and Pekkanen noting that during the early days of the party during the 1950s and 60s, these mixed liberal-democratic factions were much more loose, and they only started to become more formal a few decades later in the 1970s, as the factions became more organized, got better at raising money, and started to build up their own bases of support. Now, even though becoming party president and prime minister has been the ultimate goal of faction bosses, balancing the power of the different factions has also become very important, because there's always the threat of a faction breaking away to form a rival party. This was most notably seen in 1993, when 2 LDP politicians, Tsutomu Hata and Ichiro Ozawa, broke off to form their own political party. This then contributed to the LDP losing power for the first time since 1955, leading an 8-party coalition to take power, with Hata eventually becoming one of the few non-LDP prime ministers of Japan, but only for about 2 months. Now, in order to prevent this from happening again, LDP prime ministers had to make sure that they don't appoint cabinet members and party leaders from just their own faction. Therefore, 3 standard methods of dividing LDP offices among different factions have emerged, with one option being to give political positions based on the size of the individual factions. Therefore, larger factions can get more seats in the cabinet. However, this can also lead the smaller factions to get angry, as they'll get much fewer seats in the cabinet. The second option would be to make sure every faction is given some representation in party leadership, no matter how small they are. However, this risks angering the larger factions, as they won't be able to be as influential. The third option is to just promote the most senior members of the LDP without looking at their factional membership. However, this can lead to issues with younger members of the party who are looking to pass new policies or enact some reform. With the ability to balance the power of these factions being a core part of the job of Prime Minister. This was one of the reasons why more recent politicians, such as Shinzo Abe, was able to stay in power for so long, becoming the longest serving Prime Minister in Japanese history. Despite being on the more conservative end of the party, he is really good at building alliances, negotiating with his rivals, as well as including many different factions in his ruling cabinet. Now, the 1990s were a chaotic time for Japanese politics. The LDP lost power, a new voting system was introduced, and when the LDP returned to power, it was as a result of their alliance with smaller parties such as the Komeito, which is a party that is supported by members of a 20th century Buddhist movement called the Soka Gakkai, which was itself based on the teachings of a 13th century Japanese monk called Nichiren. This resulted in the factional system becoming very weak during the 2000s, leading to a series of LDP politicians such as Koizumi, Abe, and Fukada to become prime minister, even though they were not the leaders of their own factions and were all relatively young. Most notably, in the case of Koizumi, he was seen as an outsider, as most of the faction bosses did not support him becoming party president. In spite of this, he was still able to be elected leader, and when he became prime minister, he refused to give cabinet positions based on faction. Instead, he brought in a series of outsiders. This would include a record number of women, hereditary politicians, as well as bureaucrats from outside of the national diet. This because since he didn't have the support of the factions and their grassroots supporters, or Koenkai, he decided to appeal directly to the Japanese public instead, with popular women candidates and politicians with a famous family name, helping his cabinet become more well-known across the country. Also, by bringing in bureaucrats with no connection to elected politics, he was able to present himself as being open to reform and outside change. So, personal factions aren't necessarily a product of Japanese culture, but are a unique result of the LDP and their elections for party president. The power of factions is also not permanent, with there being this ebb and flow of how influential these factions can be. During periods of great change, such as the early 1950s, and during their loss of power in the 1990s, it looks like the role of factions and the power of more senior LDP members became much weaker, as they were unable to deliver the financial or electoral benefits to their younger supporters. This then allowed more independent and younger politicians from within the party to form new alliances and even become prime minister. While during the 1970s and 80s, when the factional system was more organized and powerful, the factions became better at helping their party members get elected and their leaders to become prime minister. However, they also made it much more difficult for younger members to rise up and enact new reforms, with this leading some LDP members to break away and form their own parties, leading the power of the LDP as a whole to decline, such as in 1993. Now, the need for faction members to constantly be raising money in order to survive and grow during election time has also led to several bribery and corruption scandals to emerge over the decades. During the 1970s, Prime Minister Tanaka was arrested as a result of the Lockheed bribery scandal. In the 1980s, Prime Minister Takeshita resigned as a result of the recruit scandal. And during the 1990s, former Deputy Prime Minister Kanemura was arrested for tax evasion as a result of the Sagawa Cuban scandal, with there being many calls and attempts for the factional system to be disbanded after every one of these issues came up. However, factions have continued to return over and over again over the years, with the more recent slush fund scandal of 2023 leading to even greater calls for reforms to be made. Now, even though there are laws requiring that the names of donors and the amount of political donations to be reported, it was revealed that certain factions within the LDP have been underreporting these numbers for several years, and possibly even decades, with a faction that includes former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe notably having underreported at least $9 million worth of donations. Now, even though this led several factions within the LDP to formally disband, the public was angered when prosecutors eventually dropped the more serious charges against most of the LDP politicians involved in the scandal, leading public support of the party to fall even further. Now, the balance of power within the LDP has also become much more complicated in recent years, after they entered into an alliance with the largely Buddhist Komeito during the late 1990s. And instead of seeing this alliance as between one large political party and one small political party, it would be more accurate to describe the Komeito as one of the many factions within the ruling alliance, with this alliance recently falling apart as a result of the election of Sanae Takaichi, a hardline conservative, as president of the LDP. Now, Takaichi is notable as she's the first female leader of the party, and unlike many members of the LDP, she doesn't come from a political family. For example, during the 2025 leadership elections, her main opponents were Yoshimasa Hayashi, the son of a former minister, and Shinjiro Koizumi, who is the son of former Prime Minister Junichiro Koizumi. She's also unique as she started her political career outside of the LDP, before eventually joining the party a few years later. So it looks like there are now talks between Takaichi and the other smaller parties in parliament to form new alliances in order to keep the LDP in power. However, this also allows these parties to potentially form an alliance without the LDP, which might lead to a completely new political order to emerge in Japan. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you next time. If you'd like to have early access and give feedback on this type of content, please consider joining the Patreon. And as always, thanks so much to my patrons, Untroid, NMS, and DC. Thank you so much for the support you have given me so far.